say it's alright, the music's good, 'cause it's alright, it's alright, it's alright, every time, oh, it's alright, oh, it's alright, we're gonna do this slow.
Welcome to Our Stories Matter. I'm Sam Lasalde.
And I'm Susie Hess.
Our Stories Matter is hosted by Trauma Informed LA and the amazing music by Torrance Brandon Reese, founding member of the music group Street Corner Renaissance. Our Stories Matter at Locals Only acknowledges the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Towangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. We pay our respects to the Honugvetam, our ancestors, Ahihirom, our elders, and Eohinkem, our relatives and relations past, present, and emerging.
Welcome, Ramona. I'm super excited to have you here today. So I am going to introduce Ramona Marchand, who is a good friend. So Ramona Marchand is a servant leader. She currently serves as a Children's Services Administrator with the LA County Department of Children and Family Services. Ramona is a licensed clinical social worker. She is an innovator and doctoral candidate at USC Suzanne Dorick Peck School of Social Work and a core steering committee member of Trauma Informed LA. She is an experienced trainer, coach, advocate, and leader with over 20 years of experience in public social services and child welfare in LA County. She is passionate about assisting vulnerable and marginalized communities and dismantling systems of oppression. Ramona served as one of the program managers for the California Partners for Permanency grant, which sought to address the disproportionately and disparity of African American and Native American children and youth in the child welfare system in California. Her mission is to continually champion work in achieving equity for all African American children engaged in the child welfare system, an advocate for social justice, and to empower and to foster healing in communities with complex needs. So welcome, Ramona Marchand. I'm super excited that you're here, and we thought that we would start with the first question of if you can just describe your work related to trauma and healing.
Well, Susie, thank you. Thank you for having me. I feel as though I don't remember when I wasn't involved in trauma and healing work. I grew up in a family of healers where people in my family, they were, people gravitated to them, to my ancestors for comfort, for understanding. So this has also been the story of my life. So in essence, I feel I've always been a social worker. As you said, I've been in public service for over 20 years, and in my current role in child welfare is really centered around community healing and partnership for underserved and marginalized communities. It's about how we create safe spaces to listen to people's stories and understand and address how they define their underlying needs. Our goal in creating cross-sector partnerships is to address the complex needs that contribute to disparities and disproportionality within the system. We center on healing communities that continually are being wounded by multiple systems. This is a collective process of learning and unlearning, of really slowing down to understand how our beliefs and biases were created. How can we be intentional about unlearning them to eradicate harm? To really think about that, how can we really unlearn to eradicate the harm that's done to vulnerable and marginalized communities? This work is about shifting the narrative and commitment to the community and leveraging our privilege to stand in solidarity for the villages that we serve.
How has this pandemic and actually the uprising that has come about caused you to radically reimagine ways that you have not before?
When you said radically imagine, I love that because I believe that this is a very unique moment in time. It's a watershed moment. So in society, we're reactive. Most spaces that I occupy, I see the reactivity within society, and we are rarely adequately prepared for any catastrophic event. My family's from New Orleans, so I think about Hurricane Katrina and how we weren't prepared for those levees to break. We weren't prepared for all of the people who were displaced. and to this day, still displaced. We weren't prepared for 9/11, for everything that happened there in New York, and for all of America. We were forever changed because of those events. The event that's going on now with the social justice, this is such a time that we weren't prepared for. Even though it's been over 400 years of oppression and systemic racism within our society for African Americans, we really weren't prepared for having a pandemic with the civil unrest that's going on in our society right now. And the reason why is because we're wired for amnesia. So we have to see the connection between trauma and amnesia. So there's a lot to do with that in regards to like burying things in our unconscious. It's a defense mechanism. It helps us to manage trauma. So right now we have the perfect storm. So with George Floyd's death and prior to his death, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, there were protests prior to his death, but they died down. There were people that spoke up, the expectation of George Floyd and what that meant to see the knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while we all watched him die, the callousness of the act, the face of the officer, him crying for his mother. It was too much for anybody to ignore. And no one in our society can say now that they don't know what's going on in our society. So the world has slowed down enough and forced us to pay attention to the blatant discrimination and oppressive symptoms that have existed in our country. So this time right now has lifted all that's wrong for people who are marginalized, people of color. So whereas a year ago, we couldn't have candid conversations about how white supremacy was embedded in practice and policies and suppressing practice for communities of colors, even though we all saw it existing day by day. But we can shift the narrative now, and we can hold these courageous conversations and hopefully create sustainable change that will carry on into next generations, because we have to make the change now. There's no other time than a time such as this. This is the time for transformational change. And as John Lewis said, it's time to get into good trouble.
Absolutely. And what you said about, what was the word, amnesia?
We're wired for amnesia because we forget, because our unconscious, we bury things. I talk to people all the time about their memories, and they'll say, I don't remember my childhood. When you say, what's your first memory? And they'll say, I was 5, or I was this, or they don't want to remember some of the things that happened. I talked to a family member recently who said they couldn't remember anything before the 6th grade, because in that immediate family, they had experienced so much trauma, because we don't want to think about it. And so when you think about all of the atrocities that have happened in our society, the people of color, we see it, we react to it immediately. Again, we're reactive. And then we kind of put it aside because we feel hopeless and powerless to be able to do something about it. And so people such as ourselves have to stand up and stand in the gap for people who don't feel powerful enough to do it. And we have to lift them up and show them that they are powerful.
Absolutely. And I think that is so incredibly powerful, especially in the current administration, that there's so much that happens hour by hour. And so I think, and then you think someone just last night, Jacob Blake, it's still happening.
Absolutely.
And it's always happened. We know that. And we know that it's happening more because of social media. And with the protests, it's still continuing. It's so important to say the names so that we don't have amnesia with the names, because the names have continued since, the beginning of the country.
Yeah, that list is endless. And it's, for me, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to hear all these different stories, and like you said, we're sort of hit with amnesia. Like, I don't remember half of the names, right? But these are all like real people that we lost by those who were supposed to protect us.
Yeah, and Ramona, for you, you do so much. And I know, by the way, I know your bio is only like a fourth of what your bio is. She's super, super humble, but I'm really interested to understand your why for doing this work.
As a social worker, even as an advocate, I wear so many hats as a social worker. I'm a therapist, I'm a matriarch, I'm an innovator, and this all leads me to my same why. I talked about before how we don't control the day we're born. We don't control the day we die. But what we do control is that dash in between. So for me, my why is about being intentional and active and consciously creating change and to be a good ancestor for my descendants, for my grandchildren and their children. My descendants will look back and they'll know that I brought my whole self to this work to create a better world for them. And that's my through line by bringing my whole self to create an anti racist world where racism is something that does not impact vulnerable communities of color. It's to empower, to guide, lift up, and level the playing field to create equity. We have to be accountable for how we interpret and experience life. I'm going to teach my babies to love your babies no matter who they are.
I love that. And I always say your grandkids are so fortunate to have you because you are changing the narrative. And when you said, I want it to be different in terms of when they look at me as an ancestor, what was your legacy?
I think that's important. And I think that sometimes we often forget that, but that has to be all of our through lines. We have to stand in, and we always are at a crossroads in a moment in time and make a choice. I tell clients all the time, this is your now. This doesn't have to be your forever. And when you go into the future and you look back or write yourself a note to say, hey, I'm going to put this in this time capsule. And you want your great, 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 great grandchild to open that time capsule. What do you want them to know about you? What do you want to stand for today? What is your story that's going to be told throughout the generations? Because we all have stories about our ancestors, but what do you want the ancestors to say about you? And what do you want your descendants to know about you? I think that's so important.
So important. And it's so you that you're super intentional and just being intentional about the legacy you're leaving for those that are about to come and knowing that you're holding your own ancestors in terms of moving forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My grandmother was a nurse, and I really look back and I think about that. And everybody in my family were a family of healers. My father was a criminal defense attorney. My mother, she was in business management, but she was the person, even my grandmother, everybody in my family, I don't remember a person that didn't take people in. It became kind of a joke in our family about you guys just take in and help everybody because that's who we are. Like I said, that's the through line of my family, to be helpers. My son is an attorney and doesn't want to do the kind of work he's doing because it's corporate law, because he says, Mom, all I want to do is help people. And what was interesting is that my daughter's a nurse and very intelligent, a labor and delivery nurse. And I sat down one day and I asked her, why don't you want to be a doctor? And she said, because Mom, I see doctors every day and they don't spend time with patients. She said, I want to be a nurse because a nurse helps people. They're the ones that stand with people and help them through their hardest times. And I had nothing to say because that is who I raised her to be.
Coming from this lineage of healers and being a healer yourself, how has this work been healing for you?
I truly believe that when you help others, you're helping yourself. They say that social workers have reasons why they choose the profession, and certainly I do as well. But it's more about how you reframe the trauma to reduce the power it had and impact it has on our bodies. So, as I said earlier, so many people can't remember their childhood. They've blocked out traumatic memories. It's so hard. But you have to be able to help people to unpack that and unpack it for yourself, to release the trauma and to breathe. Just like George Floyd said, I can't breathe. So how do you breathe to be a better as a person? So for family, community, and society, their trauma history is coming through to the other side. Like, how do we help people, including ourselves, to get to the other side? It's the stories we tell ourselves, the ones that get lost in our unconscious, the impact of our emotions, our bodies, our decisions, our relationships. I see that in our communities. I see it in our clients, systems and communities. You need to create spaces to explore our own inner narratives so that you can examine our biases and create these mental models of empathy, of collaboration, and collective problem solving. What's interesting in the work that I've been doing recently is I've been really examining complex trauma. And it's not a single incident, it's chronic exposure to trauma. And it's critical that we unpack that in ourselves and for our clients. We talk about the power of narrative change and storytelling. And for me, is actively engaged in the community to have a voice, to be resilient, and to help to impact my own trauma through the advocacy for others. I think it's important to be careful when we're engaging vulnerable populations, because as systems, we expose trauma in our communities and then we judge on how we respond, and we'll knock on the door and we'll ask people about, oh, tell me about your history. Tell me about how things are going. And then what will happen is they'll tell us and then we walk away, right? What have we done? And then they'll be angry or they'll respond. And then what happens? We judge them. And then we want to maybe take their children from them as a system. And really, it takes deeper understanding, right? So we leave clients with resources, but are we really leaving them with tools to heal from the impact that racism has had on them, particularly for families of color? So for me, it's being with people that you need to order to care for yourself, because we're relational, right? As human beings, we need other people. So it's really important that you be what people need you to be for them, but also be what you need to be for yourself as well.
100%. And, and I think about so many things you said, especially when you said, so the part about the legacy and George Floyd, and I think of his daughter, Gianna, who said, my daddy changed the world. And he absolutely did. And I look forward just to seeing who Gianna is, because her model is someone who changed the world, which, I see you. I 100% see you that way. And I see, your daughter who said she wanted to be an RN, because RNs basically are able to be relational, and we're wired for relationships and for connection, which is, again, very much you. So what is new and emerging for you personally and professionally?
Well, they say give a busy person something to do and they'll get it done. So I'm probably the definition of productivity. Personally, I'm starting my last year in the doctoral program at USC, as you said, Suzanne DeWerck Peck School of Social Work. And my research and innovation is around addressing the intersection of trauma, maternal mental health, and fatal maltreatment. So I've been looking at healing cycles of trauma and helping mothers to be seen, particularly mothers of color who've experienced multiple forms of trauma. And what I've noticed and what I've gotten through the interviews that I've done is that a lot of these mothers didn't have a role model to teach them what motherhood could be, that they've experienced complex trauma as a result of chronic exposure to trauma. It could be in multiple forms, right? It could be domestic violence, community trauma, racism. And you have to look at that, how that impacts their narrative of what motherhood is. So this is important because we have mothers who have to overcome the expectation of just being like a mother automatically, when they have children. So we have to create spaces where mothers feel safe to really reach out and tell their stories and ask for help when they need it. I think that is to really, for them to be allowed to be culturally understood, because talk therapy doesn't work for everybody. I think that you need to create healing circles and community cultural resources that people can relate to, whether that be drumming circles or just different types of things that people can connect with. I think that's very important. So for me, as a therapist, I always try to, incorporate those kind of practices into my therapy with clients. And then in regards to TILA, we're going to be starting a webinar series as well. It's going to be kind of our webinar of podcasts for Our Stories Matter. And so our Education, Advocacy, and Resources Committee is going to be doing that. And we're creating a platform also to share stories that are important to communities we serve. We're going to be talking about things like anti-racism, reentry and transformative justice, cultural healing practices. And of course, we're going to be talking about TILA Moves, which is Susie and I's bus that we're going to create, because I said there is no dream that is too big. And then professionally, our team is really working on, again, creating those community and cross-sector partnerships to help create new narratives for the community and build relationships between them for child protection. Because again, when you look at the community and you think about the Department of Child and Family Services, everyone thinks, oh, when you think of what's a social worker, we're baby snatchers. But that's not true. We're really trying to change that narrative and what that means. And how can we work in service of the community to best protect its clients? There's a really famous African proverb. It says, it takes a village to raise a child. So that was originally, I think, from Tanzania. And the original proverb was Amwana Niwa Bon. And it means that a biofamily is not solely responsible for the health and safety of the child, but it's the community, the village. So how can we create communities and community care to embody this message that's handed down from our ancestors? As I said, that's the through line. So from the very beginning, we were also always supposed to care for our children as a community and make sure that they remain safe. So I think that's very important. So we have to create better futures for children and families. And that's not possible unless we really change community conditions that surround them and making sure that communities are healthy and safe and supportive. So we have to do that in order for children to be able to thrive. I think it's important, to create hope also for every child in every home, in every zip code, to create equity. But, one of the problems with that is that people often confuse equity with equality. And I know I've said so many different things that I'm doing, but I think this is important because we talk about the groundwater and how if you look at, there's something wrong with somebody. So even with families we go out to, again, I address a lot with disproportionality for families in color in the child welfare system, particularly Black families. And we say, there's something wrong with them. Or, we put our narrative onto them based on our own biases. And how do we learn those, right? But then if you say all of these families are coming to the system at a disproportionate rate, if we know that Black families only represent 7% of people in Los Angeles County of 10 million people, but they represent 3 times that amount within the child welfare system, then clearly there's a problem, right? So it's a problem is what is the narrative and how and what are we doing? So if we're not creating, we can't give people equal resources. So if I gave you $5, Susie, and gave you, Sam, $5, you may not be able to use that $5 the same way because of our own backstories, right? So the ground is kind of sloped, and also the ground is contaminated because of the groundwater. So if all these people are coming in, then you have to say, oh my gosh, maybe it's the system. Maybe it's institutional and systemic racism. Maybe we're looking at these families differently. So what do we have to do? We have to go into the community and we have to say, what do you need in order to be able to thrive in your community, in order for you to have hope for the future and not to give up? I think that is so important for our children and families, and to give them resources that are going to be able to give them that hope for the future.
Absolutely. And hope decolonizes.
Absolutely, it does.
So it is so important that we all have hope and that communities have hope. And I mean, it's pretty amazing when I think about what's happening, today with the protests, because all the communities that are rising up has made significant change. And then I think about what you were talking about is community care, because back in the day, there would be aunts and uncles and grandparents. I mean, there would be a village literally raising each child. And now, maybe there's one, maybe there's 2. I think the average, they said, is 4 relatives for one child, where back in the day, it could have been like 50 or 60 because you had that village. And what I think is pretty cool, just to throw out, there's an agency in Los Angeles, Rainbow Services, and they have focused on not self-care, but we care. And that we care is part of actually how people can sustain in this field as well. And self-care obviously is can be connected to privilege, that you have the finances, you have the time, you have finances for childcare. And so it's pretty cool. So Trauma Informed LA has been providing wellness monthly groups for anyone who's interested, because Rainbow believes that we care is critical. Because most of us are in this field because we experience trauma. How do we sort of navigate traumas that we're hearing, especially now, knowing we're coming in with our own as well?
Right. It's so important. I think that, again, the through line, whether it be for dealing with maternal mental health, whether we're talking about providing information, resources to the community through our webinar series, whether it's through therapy, whether it's through the work that we do to dismantle disproportionality and disparity for families of color within the child welfare system. It all comes back to looking at how do we, again, together as a community, create care so that our communities can be healthy, so that everyone can thrive. There should not be a system in the future where families are disproportionately getting funneled into systems, whether that be incarcerated, whether that be the child welfare system. There's just no reason for it. In a society that we are now, we have so many resources and so many opportunities, but those opportunities are not equal for everyone. So we really have to look at how can we provide for that, and how can we stand in the gap for the families and for the individuals that in the community that need us. It's like we want to, again, our bus, Susie, we want to be there to stand there in solidarity for those people who are coming out of the carceral system, saying, you know what, you're fine, you're normal, we're here for you. You have a future. That doesn't have to be your forever. Again, that was your now, but starting today, this is going to be different. And it's about really, again, shifting that narrative. It's about narrative change.
And doing all this amazing work with Trauma Informed LA on the different projects that you've worked on, and now arming yourself even more as a healer by earning your doctorate, what does it mean for you to address trauma through activism?
I think it's important, again, to engage in these courageous conversations about race and about being comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's a spectrum. And we often talk about, just today, I was engaging in a conversation about this very thing and talking about white fragility. And what's interesting about that, Robin DiAngelo's book, if you guys, who are listening haven't heard about that, she created a whole platform and framework for how, as white people, you need to do the work and work through your own things and not be as defensive to really address white fragility. But then on the other side, people who are against that say that, why do we, as people of color, have to give you grace for your white fragility when we've been over 400 years being oppressed by society? But if we don't have those honest and transparent conversations, real talk, right, then how are we going to get anywhere? So for me, you have to be able to advocate, to have those conversations, to stay engaged and experience the discomfort, and not with any expectation of having closure. You may get to the end of a conversation and you don't have to be right or wrong or change someone's narrative about what you're thinking, but you've planted a seed. And that is narrative change. So it's important to have those conversations, to get people to see things from a racial equity lens, to stand in the gap for those, again, who can't stand for themselves, to foster racial healing. And for me, I always tell people, don't complain about a problem unless you're willing to stand up and be part of the solution. And I think that's so important because it's what defines a problem. It's about perspective. It's about really understanding where that's coming from. Because we may not always be able to see down the line, to see the labor of our work. I'm not going to be able to see my descendants. I won't be here anymore, right? But the work that we do today, we have to have faith in our tree of labor, that it will yield fruit and address this groundwater and change the hearts and minds of people in the future. So it's really about knowing what you need. It's about knowing when to rest and when to push, and to push successfully. That's the perfect dance. As I said before, to get into good trouble and to know that you're going to make a change for people. Because you can't give from an empty container, but you do have to push, and there's always a time to do it.
Absolutely. And how do you see community healing and racial healing as political?
Well, it's all political. Desmond Tutu says, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor, right? Being silent is being complicit. So if you see something, you have to do something. I mean, think about the people who didn't vote in 2016 and look at where we are today. So community healing for communities of color has always been political. You think about that. There's always been ways, even now with the whole thing with the postal system and the voter suppression, that continues today. I mean, that is just ridiculous. The status quo has maintained racial and ethnic disparities in access to public services and political power. You have to think about what our society has done and even what they're doing now, trying to stop the census, which is going to impact resources to communities of color, to families and children that need it the most, right? They're not being counted effectively. And when you go into communities to heal them, it's like being on a battlefield where they're constantly being wounded. You know, I talked about the three of us being on the battlefield and we're always trying to like put the Band-Aid on but then again, complex trauma. You have COVID, increased poverty, racial justice, voter suppression. A friend of mine said that they drove up through San Francisco this week and she says it looks like Gotham because people with little resources can't survive in this point in time. You know, we have to be there in solidarity with them to ensure that they do survive, to come out on the other side, because we want to get to that desired future state, one where Black, Indigenous, people of color have equity in all power structures and resources to address systemic and institutional racism. So as I said before, the personal is political and the political is personal, and community healing requires both.
How do you see this work that you're doing related to trauma and doing all this? How do you see it as community healing?
Well, trauma work is so important to community healing. It has its own way of like hijacking your consciousness, and clouding decisions. When you have been subjected to complex trauma, as I said earlier, as our communities have been for so long, it's going to take time to heal. But you have to address the trauma first, to actively listen to people's identified needs and to provide the tools and resources to facilitate healing. I think it's important to be seen and heard as a community, and that's part of the healing journey. But it's not, for me, a comprehensive solution, because if you see and hear people, but you don't act on what you see and hear, that's more harmful because you've shown them that you know, as I said before, at a time such as this, you can't say you don't know anymore. So what is the perception if you don't do anything about it for all of the millions of people in this country who are failing to act on the racism that's going on in our society? Is telling people that you don't care. So for me, collective impact and trust is needed to start to shift deep-seated narratives for all of our communities.
I keep thinking, you know,
Yeah.
we're probably, I think, 73 days out to November 3rd. And I think the power of narrative change, Sam's laughing that I'm like counting the days. But yet I think the power of narrative change, which is why I'm thinking, you know, it's so important to even get season 2 of Our Stories Matter out before November 3rd, because narrative change is huge in terms of political change. So what action steps, whether it's like, or resources or organizations, can you recommend for listeners to begin to take or to get involved with, so they could start advocating for social justice for African American and Native children and youth?
I think first and foremost, you really have to understand your own biases and beliefs and to be honest with yourself, to really ask yourself, how did I start to believe these things? And what are some things that I do that really embodies the thoughts that I have? And it's about being attuned and not disassociating. And when I say that, I'm going to slow down because I really want everyone to understand what I mean. I'll ask you, Susie, and you, Sam, has there ever been a time where you're driving home and you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't even remember how I got 10 minutes up the road, right? So that's disassociating, right? And the reason why people do that is because, you know, you have all of this going on, all this trauma in your head, and you automatically do that. But when you're doing that with the community, when you're doing that with the people you're working with and you say you're trying to help, that doesn't work with them because it just heightens their hypervigilance and it gives them, you know, reason to not trust, right? So for me, it's really important that you as a healer and a helper, that you're relaxed and providing a safe space. If you're the safe person, we provide as TILA safe people in the community. But I think it's so important that we don't get triggered ourselves when we're listening to the trauma that we're taking in. So for me, whether you're helping, you know, African American youth, whether you're helping individuals and communities, it's really about being attuned and listening to what they're saying. We talked about before epigenetics, Susie and I, right? We talked about nature versus nurture, but we can shift what happens with epigenetics. And so for those of you who don't know, trauma can get passed down through generations through epigenetics in your genes. And that doesn't have to be, again, your forever, because communities that are impacted through complex needs, they can choose healing over trauma, and you can change that through nurture. It doesn't have to be forever. So some of the things that I tell people, that you need to be intentional about reframing your trauma and really shifting it to one of hope, and understanding, again, their own implicit bias, foundational beliefs, and identify racial disparities and inequities in the community and society. And then again, do something about it, right? So identify and confront those racist ideas that you may hold, champion anti-racist ideas and policies, and educate yourself. One of the things that I do with clients is art journaling. And this is an intentional way to really shift the narrative and reframe trauma and to make it into something beautiful. And this could be done with any age. So you can write down whatever it is that you're experiencing, whatever memories that you have that you want to reframe. And then you write that down in a composition book or any kind of book. It doesn't have to be anything expensive. And then you cover that up with pictures out of a magazine or whatever, or draw over it and create a piece of art. And it's something that you can leave on your bookshelf. It's something that anybody can pick up and they would have no idea what you're doing. But for you, you're reframing your trauma and you're having more power over it. You're helping your body heal. For me, being intentional about doing breath work, about doing meditation, about doing all of those things that's going to help your body to heal. So I think that's important. And just in regards to educating yourself, there's so many books out there. There's The New Jim Crow. There's How to Be Anti-Racist. I mentioned Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. I think that to help children and people of color, you really have to understand the background of where all of this oppression came from. And so there's so many different resources that are out there to talk about equity. And there's different websites and stuff that I provided that you guys can talk about that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And just to do a little plug for one of the Trauma Informed LA steering committee members, Paula Miley, she has on Instagram, it's called Somatic Healers, and she practices mindfulness with communities. And the days change, so you could check her out on Instagram, and it's so healing. And also in Trauma Informed LA, we have an art section. So when you were talking about art and journaling, there's a lot of resources that are accessible for many folks. So you can check us out on the Resource Hub, and you can check out Activism and art and healing as well.
What has it been like for you today to share your story?
I'm going to take a deep breath, Sam, and I'm going to say cathartic. I think that when you tell your story, that we are open books and with blank pages, and we write our story every day. And I think that's for us and for our communities. As a professional, I'm a coach developer also for the Department of Children and Family Services. And part of our work is really getting our communities to tell their stories. So we have a program within the department called Cultural Brokers. And those are community members that go out and help to advocate for African American families to kind of address some of this disproportionality. So every year we have a summit. So one year we had on our shirts, "Tell us your story, I'm listening." And it was just an open blank book, because you get to write the narrative, right? You get to write the narrative of the pages of your story as we go along. You get to determine your story, the now, the future, and the end. You might not have been able to control the beginning, but you definitely can control the rest of your dash.
And also I wanted to add, all of Ramona's recommendations, we will be sending out in a newsletter that, like we always do after each episode, and we'll also have them on our website under the Resource Hub, because you said amazing resources that will be listed under our anti-racism link as well. So thank you, Ramona, for sharing your heartbeat and sharing you. And I'm so grateful for you, and I see you.
I see you as well, Susie. You know that you are my heart.
Thank you, Ramona. Our Stories Matter is brought to you by Trauma Informed LA, whose mission is to foster resilient communities that promote healing and well-being through collaboration, education, and community engagement. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Trauma Informed LA, and our website, traumainformedla.org. Please give us 5 stars on iTunes so more folks can have access, and donate to traumainformedla.org so we can keep recording and healing through our storytelling episodes.